there, thank you for joining us. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa Show. I am your host and producer, Addis Asafa. Today we are going to discuss about Western media warfare. These days, as it is all known, the reality which is going on in Ethiopia is distorted. I joined by Nicholas Jones from UK, analyst on African affairs, and he is going to tell us a thing that he has in its mind about Ethiopian current politics. Nicholas Jones, good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me today, Addis. It's a pleasure to be with you, and hello to all your listeners as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you are analyst of African affairs, and you closely knows what's going on in Ethiopia, right? And what do you know about the current Ethiopian situation? Obviously, the corporate oligarchs media these days are broadcasting by distorting the ongoing reality here to the global community by thinking way out to infiltrate Ethiopian politics. What do you know about the ongoing situation in Ethiopia?
Well, just to start, when what you say about Western media there, this is straight out of the Western media playbook. It's not unusual for Western propaganda to filter out amongst the globe. And if anybody looks at Western media and studies its general modus operandi, you will see that this is how Western media generally has been operating for the past 60, 50 years. And it's generally also the position of Western media to scream and shout that everybody else is creating propaganda, while the Western media only deals with objective truth and fact, but everybody else is doing propaganda according to Western media. So this is something else to point out. But to first get to your original question, like I am an African analyst. I have studied both the current situation in Africa, but also I am a study of history and the past civilizations of Africa, and have spent a lot of time studying certain African scholars such as Sheikh Anta Diop and others. And most of my studies have been done over the past 6 years, where I've been studying the present situation with development on the continent in terms of infrastructure development. Specifically, that is one of my main expertise. I am currently in the process of building a website where we'll be putting a lot more of this information together. But to talk about Ethiopia and its relation with Africa today, and also what's taking place domestically, I think it's important to recognize you want to talk about Western media and what their position is today on Ethiopia. And generally speaking, as a Westerner, I can say I have looked at CNN and BBC and such media publications to kind of get an idea of what their narrative is on the situation in Ethiopia. And as you can imagine, it's a similar position to what is often the case whenever there's a conflict in a part of the world where, let's say, the West or the NATO architecture has some strategic interests in this area, in the Horn of Africa, and has had so for quite a long time, especially with China's strategic location in the Djibouti port and such, massive shifts in the strategic balance that have taken place over the past 10 years that have certainly made the West wake up to this region of the world and take more notice about what is taking place there. So I think given the situation domestically with the TPLF and what is taking place right now in Tigray in Ethiopia, and the Western reporting which is taking place on that, I can honestly say so far it's largely been, as Western media often does, a big mixture of truth and lies. So we are getting, on one hand, some objective facts on the ground about the situation. Maybe often when BBC or such an outlet reports on this situation, they will give you some objective facts about what's taking place on the ground, the historical roots of this conflict and so on and so forth, and maybe some issues with the previous administration in relation to the current administration that is now in Ethiopia with Abiy Ahmed at its helm as prime minister, who has done some brilliant initiatives since he's been leader of the state. But it's probably due to that as well that the Western media considered its role as kind of a destabilizing effect in that area, and basically writes articles in such a way that make them look like they're telling you objective facts when actually they are putting a spin on the situation and are largely anti-government in their appraisal of the situation on the ground, and are often talking about humanitarian issues, human rights issues, kind of the similar pretext of what we would have used in Afghanistan or in Libya or Syria. It's always the same proxy that's used. It will be, we will often use military intervention and say that the excuse for that is humanitarian. But then often when we start these wars for humanitarian reasons, we actually end up exacerbating the humanitarian situation on the ground far worse. As we know with Iraq, over 1.5 million Iraqis were killed in that occupation or in that war. I think anybody who's studied the past 20 years of total war that's been taking place from the Western direction, you will see that regardless of those proxies, regardless of those excuses as to why we intervened in those different countries, if it was ever on humanitarian grounds, in the end, the conclusion, the final result turned out not to be so humanitarian at all, and millions of lives were lost. And I think Ethiopia would do well not to follow the same path as those other countries that trusted the West at one time and then found out the hard way that trusting us was not such a good idea.
Okay, good. Yeah, the corporate oligarchies, which means the imperialists these days, are waging a very voracious war in Ethiopia, a very sovereign nation ever existed in history, and has never surrendered to any foreign aggression. They waged war through their media, which is a media warfare. They did aid cuts. They again made a visa restriction. Again, they back up rebels. All these are unacceptable things by the general public and the federal government of Ethiopia. And it doesn't really make sense at all. Still, the US, especially, and the European Union are leapfrogging with TPLF. And how do you see this link and association as well? The truth is with the general public. People are demonstrating these days in supporting the military, which resist and fight the rebels out there in the North Province. But by giving a cold shoulder to the general public and the federal government, to the very legitimate government, the US particularly are dancing and tied a knot with the rebel TPLF. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. For anyone who actually doesn't follow the Western narrative and actually follows Western policy on the ground and looks at the actual actions and not the words of these officials that are on the ground. So take the US envoy who recently visited, and also Samantha Power from USAID, USAID, I should say, sorry, who recently visited and didn't get the chance to sit down with Abiy Ahmed. She was deeply disappointed about that for obvious reasons. Yeah, they're dancing. Like you say, they're sitting on the fence, so to speak, but they're certainly having a kind of romantic dinner with the TPLF in the sense that they are wining and dining them. And basically, if we talk of diplomatic talk, when these countries, these Western countries talk about humanitarian situation, or when they start basically finding reasons to lightly, because right now it's very light, but they're lightly attacking the government. saying it's the government causing the humanitarian situation, it's the military from the government that are causing the fighting, and that the conflict is coming from now. The Eritrean troops are now entering the country, and so now it's their fault that the conflict is rising. But of course, the very first point that we have to notice in Ethiopia is that the point of opposition is caused from the Tigray region wanting to break away. Now, if this region has any aspirations to independence of any sort, this kind of discussion, like much like Spain with Catalonia, or much like Scotland with England, if you are going to have this discussion, it needs to be a national discussion. Not that part of the country cannot break away by its own will. You have a constitution to abide by, and when countries wish to announce their independence, they must have that discussion with the entire country and not just their singular province, for you are breaking away from a country, not from your province. Much like in Spain, right? There is this issue of independence with Catalonia, and always when they do a referendum, they just ask the people of Catalonia. But it's not their decision alone. It's also the decision of the people of Spain, for it is the people of Spain that are going to lose that province if that province votes for independence. And the people of Spain also have a choice to make as to whether that province should be allowed or not, or has political grounds to make that decision. Now, independence, whenever we talk about independence, it's always a bit of a schism, because on one hand, you have the idea of increased freedom. Often people think that if you just break away a particular province from a country, you will get more rights, you will get more freedoms, you will get more liberty. But this is not the case. Sensually to us, it may appear that would increase your liberty, increase your freedom by creating smaller and smaller independent breakaway provinces, breakaway countries. But if you look at Europe, which is a continent of maybe the most fractured amount of land space geographically, through the consistent wars that took place over the past 500 years throughout the European continent, you will actually see that fracturing of society has caused enormous amounts of division and disunity in European culture. And for many hundreds of years, we were fighting wars that even at one point caused, when we were fighting the Crusade and things like this, caused an entire Dark Age where most of Europe's population, or at least 1/3 of it, was lost to disease, warfare, and all sorts of other horrible things. So actually, when we talk of dividing countries, like, it sounds nice on paper, but in practice, it often causes a lot of suffering. And people should move towards harmony and unity if they want to get increased freedoms, because with a larger whole, the parts can exercise themselves a lot better. And this is, I think, a constitutional issue for Ethiopia that needs to, which I'm not so well versed on historically, the reasons for the Tigray wanting this, or kind of sticking to this idea of independence, or what are the grounded reasons for why they wish for this, or if there's any really grounded political reasons for wanting this, or if it's coming as an external force, or that maybe they're being corrupted from outside to basically push for this, for the West to be able to use this kind of conflict as another region to basically use this as an excuse for intervention, maybe, or maybe to put forces on the ground, or maybe to have NATO intervention. So I think Ethiopia, politically, they have to be very careful about how they handle this situation, because you certainly don't want outside intervention. That's the first thing I think Ethiopia wants to avoid, to stop the West from finding the political grounds to interfere in this conflict. It must be dealt with regionally. And I think if Sudan and Kenya and Egypt, if they can be of help, which I know right now is another point of conflict, because you have the whole discussion around the GERD, which is a major strategic issue for all those 4 countries that I mentioned, especially 3 of them. So there's lots of things blurring the lines right now in all of these topics, and it seems to be for Ethiopia, the path of development that Ethiopia has chosen is causing Ethiopia to receive a lot of attention from the West right now. And we also have to talk about China if we're to understand the full context of why the West is now suddenly paying a lot of attention, both media narrative and also politically, to the Horn of Africa, and more specifically the country of Ethiopia, which, as you said before, the oldest nation state in the world.
Why the US intervene in Ethiopian affairs, particularly in rescuing TPLF by disgracing the very legitimate administration, and why the US administration, the US government under Biden's administration chose to leapfrog with TPLF?
It's a good question, because the administration before, the Trump administration, I think a lot of people expected that relations would get better after this administration had finished, and that under Biden, things between Ethiopia and America would get warmer. But actually, it's turned out not to be the case. And at least from my analysis and from my opinion, what I can say is that it looks to me like another, basically another potential for the US and the NATO architecture to use this conflict between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray region to exacerbate the situation on the ground, and to basically use it as an excuse for more intervention on the African continent. And this would be used as a strategic piece to stop the China's Belt and Road Initiative from increasing its role on the African continent. And also essentially not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but to stop Ethiopia, which is on a straight high-speed train to the future in terms of its development process, to try and slow down as much as possible Ethiopia's infrastructure building and process of development, which has been going on for the past 10 years.
Okay.
That for me would be the main reason why the West, and specifically America, sees now as a good time to intervene. And also we've just had the pullout of Afghanistan, and right now, there are not any real wars happening apart from Yemen.
Okay, if you brought that topic, let me add some question on it.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about Afghanistan. And after 2 decades of bitter resistance, Taliban took over the entire Afghanistan, and Ashraf Ghani hosted and went to that's Uzbekistan, I'm not really sure, and it's under Taliban's administration now, right? I mean, the involvement of the US there was big. And can you say US did accomplish its mission properly, or US is loser when it comes to Afghan politics?
Well, they certainly accomplished their mission if their mission was to destroy a country and leave it as they found it, or no, not even leave it as they found it, leave it far worse off than as they found it. Anybody who actually analyzes infrastructure, like physical industry, will see that for all of the nation building that was supposed to take place in Afghanistan, not much was done. We have heard stories of roads that were built to nowhere, and of power stations that were built in the middle of deserts that served no one. So all of this $3 trillion or so of spending that the US used of taxpayer money and printed willingly, without even asking the US population or the general public if this was okay. And even I think at the time, most countries did not agree to go to war in Afghanistan. The United Nations at the time, I believe, was not fully on board, and still, as per usual, the West went ahead and conducted an illegal occupation of that country. And especially also if you consider that, if we get into the CIA warfare, that the Taliban in its original origin is an outfit that kind of stems from the Mujahideen, which was created to fight the Soviet Union back in the early 80s. And at one time, the Reagan administration had the Taliban or some affiliate of the Taliban in the White House, and were supporting them politically on the ground as freedom fighters before the Afghanistan war took place. Now, this is the kind of textbook modus operandi, like I was saying before, of the West when it comes to regime change operations. They create the problem, and then they use that problem as the excuse for intervening in those countries. But if people look a bit, look at the funding and follow the money trail before those wars start, you'll see that a lot of the so-called moderate rebels or these terrorists or freedom fighters or however you wish to call them are in fact funded, trained, and directed by Western intelligence agencies across the board. I'm not just talking American now, I'm also talking British. The British Defense Ministry, as well as MI6 and MI5, have been caught red-handed multiple times funding illegal activity in terrorist activity all over the world. It happened in Syria, and it's been happening a lot longer before then, and continues to happen. And if people kind of can get some general understanding, it's not a conspiracy theory. These things are well documented by journalists from all over the world. Currently, one who is in prison in the UK right now, Mr. Julian Assange, who is facing crimes for basically exposing the truth, which as a human citizen, I do not consider exposing the truth as a crime by any such means, but that man is currently on the verge of losing his life for saying the truth and exposing these illegal wars and occupations that have taken place throughout my entire lifetime. And I think, for one, it's high time that came to an end, and that Western people especially stand up to their governments and say it's high time that this ends. We've had enough of our tax money being spent on these illegal wars. They're not justified. They're illegal wars. They're illegal interventions. They're not making the situation on the ground any better, as we can see with the situation in Afghanistan, who now, after just a short week or two, the Americans didn't even have a chance to leave, and the Taliban has already taken over pretty much every single major city in the country. But apparently they were telling us, the Biden administration was telling us, that they had trained over 300,000 Afghan soldiers. Well, we don't know. We don't know what happened to those soldiers. What was the situation on the ground? And that we're getting a narrative from the West that says, that the Taliban are now causing problems in the streets, and that there's violence, and that there's this and that going on. But if anybody actually follows the situation on Twitter or looks for like first-hand accounts of the situation on the ground, it doesn't look too chaotic. And actually, from afar, it looks like the chaos is really taking place in the airport. And Kabul, from what I can make out, seems to be right now under orderly control. I don't know how much longer it's going to remain like this, but we do have Russia and China in the region who seem to be stage managing the whole situation on the ground and have stayed in Kabul. Their ambassadors are staying in Kabul with the ambassadors of Pakistan as well, and other players in the region, to help the Taliban navigate this very tricky time politically, and to see if basically, that they can get a government which is representative of the entire political arena in the country, which of course would be best for Afghanistan to have political voices from many different sides, and to bring them all together as a transitional government. hopefully, with those players in the region, it's in everyone's best interests to make sure that this happens. Now that America and the West are out of the way, I consider there's a lot more political space to maneuver, especially for the Taliban, but also for the other players in the region. And if they can get, you know, Hamid Karzai and the different other players as well from the different tribes or whatnot in Afghanistan, and to get them to come together and to at least start talking instead of shooting, which I'm sure everyone in Afghanistan is tired of now after 20 years of hard fighting. I think it's high time that there's a political agreement that, and the country can start making some sort of physical progress. I mean, China's offering development much like it offers Africa.
Okay.
I think people should take this line of option rather than warfare now. Development is the peace on this planet. So yes.
So many critics and analysts like you yourself condemning the involvement of America in Afghan politics, and at the end of the day, US is loser when it comes to Afghan politics. And in contrary, including the head of state, Biden tweeted saying, when we went to Afghanistan before 20 years ago, we went for a reason and we did that. You see this paradox? He did this not to be said a loser, doesn't he? What do you think about it?
Well, a loser. Yes, 100%. But most Western politicians are detached from reality, or either they're detached from reality or they know that what they're saying is a lie. Now, I would say it's the latter, not the former. Western politicians are well trained in spin operations. They know how to spin a situation. But this debacle, this tragedy, this absolute, absolute inferno of a fire, this situation in Afghanistan that America's
the US invested more than Vietnam War on Afghan
and like a lot of media, alternative media has said, we can see the parallels with Vietnam and Saigon and the pullout in Vietnam and how drastic and tragic that was. We can see all the parallels. Anybody looking at the photos of Afghan nationals falling from airplanes in the sky, like this is tragic. I don't think any world leader, regardless of the spin they put on this, can paint this as something rosy or like ideal, or like, as Biden said, can even for 1 second claim that this is what we intended to do. Because if it is what you intended to do, that's murder. Like, if that's what you intended to do, you've ended up destroying hundreds of thousands of people's lives, if not millions, if we talk about the region in general. So if that's what you intended to do, you basically just stated your case as a murderer. And that's exactly what we can say Western empire has become today, like a force for murder and strife and civil conflict and division, disunity. And basically anywhere you look in the world, if you're looking for tragedy, just follow Western policy, foreign policy, and you will find enormous amounts of tragedy, enormous amounts of human displacement, refugee crisis, immigration. Look at Europe right now. What was that cause? Libya and the entire, fracturing of their state. I mean, I put these in diplomatic words. I should be more honest. Like, we destroyed Libya. We killed their leader. We took the country apart piece by piece. We sold off all their assets. And now, they face some of the highest poverty rates in Africa, when before this country was also on a pathway towards development and had some sort of social security net for the people who live there. They had such things as free education, free healthcare for certain classes and whatnot, and at least some standard of living. Now, Libya is a safe haven for terrorism, and now is a breeding ground for all forms of extremism. And it's just the same playbook year in, year out for the past 30 years. I mean, I was born into this. So anybody with an open eye who's actually looking at what Western policy is will see that it's a policy of tragedy.
Whenever there is destruction and failed state, US is there. We can mention Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, you can name it.
Keep going.
Yeah. In their land, in the US, they just preach us that they are a very democratic nation, and they always preach about democracy, about human rights, and they condemn others on the violation of human rights, mass atrocity, you see?
Well, it's a big question, but I'll try to keep it short. For me, America is a tale of two cities. It's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Yeah.
So the trouble is with America, it's a very young nation, and still politically seems to misunderstand its founding or what it was founded upon. And I think oftentimes in the West, we have this idea that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. And therefore, when you have such things, pieces of paper like the Constitution of America, the Constitution of the United States of America, or Declaration of Independence, which both are extremely important documents for the extension of human rights, freedom, and liberty for all people on this planet, especially when you consider that it's one of the first republics to break away from the ideology of empire in Europe at the time. And it is one of the first countries in the world to set forth on this planet in that size, which became a republic founded by the people, of the people, and for the people. Very wonderful things and wonderful ideals that were set into the historic library by those founding fathers, who we all know as great people. And me personally, also a student of Alexander Hamilton and such figures. I'm fully like a great lover of American tradition and culture and political ideology too. But America today is not Alexander Hamilton's America. Okay, you can just see that from the economy, for example, right? If you just look at the money, you can see that Wall Street and the neoliberal economic system that we have today is not a Hamiltonian banking system. It's not a national banking system like you saw in the founding of America, which is what made America the great nation that it is today. It's not capital neoliberal reforms or speculation on Wall Street or selling stocks for a bargain or for over speculated prices and then seeing those crashes happen every 12 years. That's not what American economics was founded on. No, it's founded on Alexander Hamilton's political economy, which was one of industrialized nations which used physical production to raise their nation and increase the jobs and increase the wealth of that nation. America would not have been able to become as powerful it is today militarily without that political economy in place. It's actually Roosevelt who uses, Roosevelt, a Democrat, by the way, on the other side of the aisle, who uses the very same economic reforms as Hamilton and extends those reforms with different financial advisors in his administration that help him. But is also using the political discourse of Henry C. Carey, who was Lincoln's financial advisor. So this kind of American system, this political economy system coming from Hamilton, which has its roots in France with Colbert and such thinkers of the 17th century, is a different form of America than what you have today. And America, like I say, is standing on the shoulders of giants. Those are the giants I'm talking about: Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, people who wrote the Declaration of Independence. People say it was Jefferson, but that's a matter for another time. Jackson, a naughty man. But it's a discussion for another day. But to talk about present America, it's a Jekyll and Hyde situation. When you look at the American administration, even the Trump administration or any administration in the past, basically since the death of JFK, who for me is the last American president who I can say was out and out, especially in ideology, very much the same as a John Adams or a Washington or a Hamiltonian figure. We haven't had a president since JFK who actually stuck to the ideals of the original idea of what America was supposed to represent, which was a nation that was not interested in empire, was not interested in going around the world and using basically a policy of colonization to control and loot and rob other countries of their resources and of their strategic power, which is basically what America has been doing since, the end of the Second World War, when sadly Roosevelt died an unexpected death, and the kind of conclusion of the Second World War was decided by Britain eventually, and President Truman, who completely went off on a different path to what Roosevelt was intending with the United Nations. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very big question. It's something
Exactly.
to get into more studies. But America really is a nation of two cities, of two ideologies, and its base is really in economics more than politics, because politics is narrative, but really in economics, in the logistics, in the logical stuff, in the numbers, and in the ideology. We can see that America today is not what America started out as, especially when you look at foreign policy, because that $3 trillion that was spent in Afghanistan, I know for one, Alexander Hamilton would have spent that on American infrastructure and used it to make the standard of living better for the average American than spending it on a war that ended up being a waste of time, because the Taliban is still the Taliban, and they're back. So in the end, it was $3 trillion for...
Western media are plotting a false narrative out of the ongoing situation in Ethiopia. As I have said, the US, a very advocate of democracy, human rights, and other developments, whatever, still standing with all the evils and tragedies here. TPLF is labeled as a terrorist group by Ethiopian parliament. How dare a very democratic nation who teaches about democracy would prefer to stand with this troublemaker?
Well, I think you kind of answer it in your question to some degree, but we spoke about it. You mentioned oligarchism and corporatism before, and from my studies, what I was looking at in Ethiopia with your policy on development and infrastructure development, like I was saying before, Ethiopia is on a high-speed train towards the future. And right now, the government is spending an enormous amount of resources on strategic infrastructure to sort out the energy crisis within the country. Transport infrastructure in terms of trains, they have built the electric train between Addis Ababa and Djibouti, which is the longest such train on the African continent, which is electrified. It's over 750 kilometers long for anybody who's watching. It's a fantastic example of Ethiopian ingenuity and ability to construct modern infrastructure and to support their population with modern infrastructure and increase everyone's standard of living universally. And it's this kind of stuff which is taking place in Ethiopia, which I think really scares the West, because when you build these kind of things, you're going to see rapid progress, both in the political department, in economy, in humanitarian areas, in human rights. We talk about human rights often in the West as a kind of sentimental, metaphysical aspect of like, do I have my emotional rights today? So that I can go out and protest and speak my mind, right? Because of course in the West, it's easy to just turn on a tap and have clean drinking water. It's easy to go outside and put your bins in the bin and have that all taken away to a garbage site and dealt with in a sanitary way. And that whenever you go to your bathroom, all of your water and stuff is taken away and dealt with in a clean manner. But on other continents in this planet, actually the majority, South America, Africa, Asia, there are still major issues with development, major shortages and lack of standard of living in different countries. And for example, in Ethiopia, as you well know, not in Addis Ababa, but in other parts of Ethiopia, you cannot just turn on a tap and drink the water. It is not safe to just always use things without thinking before. And you have a different standard of living. And you see, when countries are in poverty and have humanitarian strife and have human rights issues, and basically, more often than not, they are stemming largely from lack of development.
Okay.
If we talk about the right to water or the right to food or the right to light or, you know, the right to security, how can a woman in Ethiopia have security if she doesn't have street lights? She's not going to be very secure walking down a dark road. That's just a matter of fact. It's not how I feel about it. It's just a matter of fact. So when the West starts to see a country develop and make its life better, it basically makes it harder for the West to then use its corporations and all of its oligarchs to cause or to use that suffering to make profit out of that suffering and to use as a potential, like we were saying before, to intervene in your political situation and basically to like you say, you know, link with the opposite side, even though they're designated as a terrorist organization. The West, of course, is going to link with them because it's another way of stopping Ethiopia's political unity, causing division in your political situation, which will slow down your development process, is what they hope, and potentially put more pressure on Ethiopia with situations like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which the West was already applying pressure there using Egypt and Sudan, especially Sudan. We can see how now there are some overtures to Sudan from the West to basically intervene in the situation in a way which maybe could be helpful and may not be so helpful. That's up to Sudan to make the decision as to how they're going to play their cards in this game. But I would advise, if I could, as an outside analyst, as an outside advisor with any knowledge that I may have, although it's not very much, I can honestly say, it's really important that the region sorts this out regionally and the international players try and as much as possible and by any means without violence to come to a political organization to satisfy everyone. It's important.
Appreciate it. Since you are an expert on African affairs and as an expert on African affairs, you keenly and closely know Ethiopian politics, and you know TPLF very well as well, and you know a lot about the new regime which is being undergone by Abiy Ahmed, right? Can you put your comparison? And what do you know about TPLF? And what do you know about a new regime?
Yeah. Well, Western media, of course, is exacerbating the problem. They're making it look bigger than what it is. Like I was saying before, this is no more than a regional affair. It's not abnormal for provinces within nations to have issues with how they feel they are being run or how they are being managed or how the central administration of that government is dividing the political power, okay? It's not abnormal. Now, look, in Spain, okay, just to come back to that example, they had a referendum in Spain where they offered up the option of Catalonia becoming an independent state. Okay, first things first, did the US intervene? As far as I can see, no, they did not, right? Because it's Spain, and they had no interests in that region, and they knew that the European Union could handle it. Even the European Union, yeah, they did intervene, and they were dancing with separatists. Um, it seems to be the modus operandi of the West that whenever they see the potential to break something up, they do. They go for it. They take it as because it's like I said, if you're an oligarch or you're in the business of profiteering from basically tragedy or humanitarian strife, that's going to be your kind of modus operandi. That's going to be your method of doing things. And like I say, since JFK died, that has been the Western kind of policy making based around division, divide and conquer, right? It comes from the British Empire slogan. We know we've been doing it for 5 years, 500 years, sorry, not 5 years, 500 years. So if anybody knows well, the British Empire knows well. Having studied the British Empire, I know well all of the divisive tactics that were used in Kenya, in South Africa, and Australia, and Canada, and India, and every other country that we colonized. So for anybody who studied real Western history, or like very specifically British history, you'll see how divide and conquer works. It's a pretty simple method of operating, and that is the way that the West has gone about exercising its policy in Ethiopia now. And we're at the very beginning of this narrative where at the beginning they make it look like they're sitting on the fence and that they're just talking on humanitarian grounds, and they're saying to the Ethiopian government, like, please just back off another week while while this terrorist organization is causing chaos. And what's the Ethiopian government supposed to do while you have military action taking place in the streets in a province which, by constitutional law, they are responsible for providing the security of that province? Now, that province right now is not independent. They are not their own nation. They are still under the laws and under the order of that government. And if, like I said before, if they would like to have that political discussion about autonomy or whatnot, that needs to be done without shooting. You cannot talk about these political aspects if you're picking up guns and such things. So you have to ask yourself: are the TLPF really serious about politics, or are they just looking to use this conflict as a way of getting support from the West as well? Because I know lots of different factions in the world. They often create. It happened in Syria, yeah, where there's a lot of funding that was pouring into Syria from these different NGOs from the West, where they're pouring money into these different protest groups, much like basically anything which is anti-government. They put money into these groups and they fund them, and they pull more and more young minds who are impressionable and indifferent to the political arena and can't really see the greater aspects of what are taking place both regionally and internationally. But people are pulled by this money, and therefore they can very quickly build a narrative within that country, especially from the outside. When people aren't on the ground doing objective journalism, it's very easy to paint a narrative. And they do it effectively, and they make it look like basically there's 500,000 anti-government protesters when maybe there's just 1,000 to 5,000. And you'll have all over the BBC like anti-government protests in Syria. They want to get rid of Bashar Assad, and this is popular, and this is what popular opinion is in Syria, when actually it turned out that there wasn't that much popular support for regime change. Life in Syria was relatively good before the war. Not perfect like any country. I think if anybody looks at the human rights record of Britain with Julian Assange right now in prison, it's not a very good record. Or if we look at the record of the US with Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners that they've held there, without trial or without seeing a judge for how many years now? So the human rights record of these countries who all day are going to say to Ethiopia, you need to uphold human rights. You need to be good to the TLPF. You need to treat them with patience and kindness and just wait for them to calm down, right? Just wait and everything will return to normal, we promise. But they don't tell you that maybe they're funding, maybe they're talking to these people, maybe they are directing them, maybe they, and this is the thing, the world is a stage, as Shakespeare said, and we must remember that these politicians, they are acting out their policy. They are making sure that they see that their agenda is met and that the conclusion is in their favor. And if it's not, then they lost. They lost the battle. And right now, most of these strategic points on the planet, given the situation that we have with China in the East and Russia, these places are basically hot points for a scene to take place. And I think what we're watching right now is a scene of a greater play right now in Ethiopia, which the West is, of course, going to use as much as possible to intervene and try and use it as pressure on the Ethiopian government to do what the West wants them to do. And if they don't do what they need to do, you can expect that the provocation and the pressure will get worse. I don't think Ethiopian people should expect that the West will just go away. We never do. And they're going, but yeah, it's important to really play the political situation very sensitively, because if the West feels that they have a strong enough narrative to intervene physically, if you look at Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, I can keep going, then you will see that the situation normally amounts to that they will intervene.
Okay.
Regardless of what other international players say. So, yeah.
Yeah. Appreciated Nicholas Jones from UK, analyst on African affairs. Time flies, and I would like to wrap up my discussion here. Thank you for giving us this insight on the media warfare and oligarchies interference in Ethiopia. Thank you for your precious time, sir.
Thank you for having me. And any other time you want to do an interview, I'd love to talk more about African infrastructure and more positive things that are taking place on the continent, because that's also brilliant, and there's so much good stuff in Africa right now.
Time flies, dear viewers. You'll be watching Future Africa show. I would like to wrap up it here. Hope you had a wonderful insight about US hypocrisy and Westerners media warfare. And thank you very much for watching again. Bye-bye. See you next time with another edition. Take care.